Hi, Matt.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I am good.
Good.
Thanks for having me.
Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available on both streaming video and as an audio podcast. Or you can do both at once if you want. And you are Matt Cooper. First of all, an old friend and colleague from back at the New Republic, but also someone who is involved in an unfolding kind of story, I would say, which involves several intersecting themes. So one is I don't want to say implosion of Newsweek magazine, an august American publication, but let's say it's going through some challenging times.
Mm-hmm.
And also another theme is fake news, which figures in this, and how fake news finds its way into websites. And there's an interesting little advertising fraud story that I think doesn't involve Newsweek per se, but the parent company of Newsweek has been accused of committing advertising fraud in ways that could conceivably be related to fake news, or at least the pressure to generate a lot of seeming ads could be related to the pressure to generate a lot of fake news. And I think, and also part of this story is, for our younger viewers and listeners, is the place that the Newsweekly once held in American journalism, which you and I were both witness to and involved in. And so maybe near the end, we'll do a little reminiscing and see how many people we lose while we're talking about the good old days when we were really well paid. But first, since, some people may say, well, wait, Matthew Cooper, isn't that name familiar? Isn't the face familiar? You were also involved in a very prominent episode 10 years or so ago when you almost went to jail for protecting a source. This is when you were at another Newsweekly, Time Magazine, right?
That's correct.
You want to just quickly refresh our memory? What happened there?
Sure. Well, in 2003, I started to get involved in what became known as the CIA leak case. This is after the after the Iraq War had begun, and the Bush administration went after a former ambassador who'd been commissioned to investigate the question of whether Saddam Hussein had sought to buy a kind of uranium in Africa.
That was Valerie Plame's husband? Is that?
Yeah, exactly. A former U.S. ambassador, very widely respected, named Joe Wilson, who, at the behest of the CIA, went back to Africa, where he had been an ambassador. He'd also been the last U.S. official in Iraq before the first Gulf War in the 90s. Anyway, he went over there, found, to his satisfaction, that the Iraqis had not sought uranium. He wrote a few months after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, he wrote and at a time when people were wondering, well, where is all this WMD that we just went to war for? He kind of galvanized all that opposition by saying, hey, I went to look for it at the behest of the CIA, and I didn't find any. So it was a huge deal. The administration kind of trashed him and his wife, who worked at the CIA. In the course of doing it, they revealed her identity. So they revealed the identity of a supposedly, I guess, covert agent. That's right. She had been, and that is potentially a crime. So Democrats were outraged. New York Times was outraged. Many people were outraged. And so what happened was there was a special prosecutor involved because, hey, there's always a special prosecutor
Fitzgerald
involved.
Or Fitzpatrick or something?
A fellow named Patrick Fitzgerald, who at the time was the Bush-appointed U.S. attorney in Chicago. He was appointed by James Comey.
I've heard that name.
Yeah, because the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, had recused himself. So Fitzgerald called lots of people in as witnesses, and he was very interested in talking to me because I had talked to a couple of sources who had pushed back on Plame and Wilson, and I didn't want to reveal my source. Time Inc. Fought to keep me from testifying under the guise that journalists should enjoy the same kind of, confidentiality privilege that doctors and patients, priests and parishioners, and others enjoy. It's a case that went on for more than a year, went all the way to the Supreme Court, which declined to hear our case. And so I was compelled to testify. I was, thought I would still have to go to jail to avoid talking about my source, but my source did come forward and did give me permission to speak, and so I did, as did eventually all the journalists.
So who was your source then?
It was Karl Rove, and I had also spoken with Scooter Libby, who had been Cheney's chief of staff. I had tried to, do what I could to sort of reveal that they were trashing Plame and Wilson. Anyway, I got caught up in this for some period of time and was in the papers a lot as the subject of the story rather than writing.
Were you at some point thinking you might actually go to prison and starting to get nervous?
Oh, quite a bit. Yeah. I mean, it had gotten to the point where I had a very good white collar criminal defense that pursued this through the courts. It included Ted Olson, the former U.S. Solicitor General, who would become known a few years later for leading the case for marriage equality to the Supreme Court, and other attorneys, the First Amendment attorney Floyd Abrams. So I was really prepared for it, and had made preparations as such. I'm not out of any great courageous thing. I just sort of.
Were you starting to research prisons and thinking, well, this one would be better than that one?
Well, it's really funny. There's a whole industry of white collar prison consultants who prepare the unjailed for their life in prison. And actually, my criminal defense lawyer did hook me up with one. So I had prepared for it.
What, they say things like bring toothpaste? What do they say?
Well, it's interesting. There's no such thing really as a country club prison. That's kind of a myth that they're really,
But there are less grave and more grave situations.
Absolutely. There are minimum securities, and they said where, that's where you're likely to go, and it's not going to be like the HBO series Oz, or, you're not going to be, someone's wife. But it's not fun, and here's some ways to, conduct yourself, and here are the kind of jobs you might want to try to get in prison. And
so you were getting the tutorial,
Oh, I had gotten the tutorial.
I want to be the guy cleaning the dishes. I want to be, you were thinking about these things. Yeah,
there are actually kind of tricks of the trade, and I'm glad I never had to explore them. So, I was fortunate enough to dodge that bullet with the support of.
Okay. Now let's move to the bullet you didn't entirely dodge.
Right.
You resigned along with some. Well, in the course of a few days, it seems like several Newsweek staffers resigned. Is that right? Within the past week or so.
Yeah. If I can back up a little. Newsweek is, for many years, incredibly successful. One of the big three Newsweeklies, along with Time and U.S. News and World Report. It was owned by the Graham family of the Washington Post fame and of the film The Post. In 2011, I believe they sold it, seeing that financially it was very hard to swing. The same headwinds that affected all print media really came down hard on the Newsweeklies, and so they sold Newsweek to the audio mogul Sidney Harman of Harman Kardon Speakers,
the husband
of former California Congresswoman Jane Harman, who's now president of the Wilson Center in Washington. He only held on to it for about a year before selling his stake to Barry Diller, the head of Interactive Corporation, former studio boss. He had it for a couple of years. He let Tina Brown run it. She, the famous buzzy former editor. I had forgotten
that she actually ran Newsweek after she was.
She did. Yeah. She merged it with the Daily Beast, which she was already.
I knew she ran the Beast. I didn't realize. I guess. Now it's ringing a bell. She was running both at once for a while.
Yeah, I think she only had it for about a year because before it just became too.
But see, now I'm thinking. I remember her deciding that she would just merge the brands. And did she preserve Newsweek as a distinct brand?
Well, she did for a while, but she closed down the print edition. So once that was gone, that was a pretty big blow to it. So just to fast forward to 2013, some investors buy the place, and a very respected editor, an old friend of mine named Jim Poco, becomes the editor of Newsweek, and he does really, I think, a heroic and yeoman's job of bringing it back to life.
He's a former New York Times.
He's former New York Times editor, former Reuters, former Condé Nast, former U.S. News, and very smart guy. And he brings it back to life. Hires good people. Actually gets the print edition rolling again. Advertisers kind of have a newfound interest in print. They suddenly realize, hey, people like to sit with those things for a long time. Mm-hmm. That might be a more attractive place to put my luxurious ad instead of a click banner kind of ad. So, he meets some success, but after a couple of years, he gets fired. The owners are impatient about the financial situation.
Can we pause here while I ask a question? I actually want to do two things. I want to tell people that you wrote a piece for Politico that recounts some of this, and we'll link to it. And
sure.
If there's any details that seem fuzzy, they can go refer to that. But also, I remember when the print edition was resurrected under his editorship, and I remember kind of getting excited because I thought I saw signs of some kind of, on foreign policy, which is a particular interest of mine, some kind of edgy, kind of left-wing stuff that was a little more out of the mainstream than I remembered, Newsweek being. Was there anything systematic in that way, or did I just happen to see a couple of pieces that were?
Well, I think it tried to be heterodox. I think his idea was to, encourage and to make it very much a reporter's magazine and to encourage what's called long-form journalism. And it had some contrarian ideas. He's a former foreign correspondent, in the Far East, so he had a lot of interest in that. And, I think it was an interesting product. Anyway, it's kind of struggled along on a couple of other editors since, including a terrific pair this week, Bob Rowe and Ken Lee, but I don't want to confuse people with too many names. Here's where things get really crazy. The owners of the magazine it was found to be in some considerable legal jeopardy in the last few weeks. The New York Police Department and the Manhattan DA's office served warrants in the office. It's not entirely clear what they're investigating, probably financial shenanigans on the part of the owners. So the editors of Newsweek are terrific guys and leading a great staff. They assigned a couple of reporters to cover the action at their own magazine, which, happens sometimes in journalism. You're the story. Mm-hmm. And so they put a couple of great reporters on it. And the owners, in sort of like a Trump shutting down Mueller kind of situation, they fired the editors and fired the reporters who were investigating them from within, creating a huge firestorm. I decided to resign at that point. I just felt it was pretty tough to work there. How many other staffers? Well, I think about a dozen have left since then, so it's a pretty goodly number. And I have no beef with those who've stayed. I mean, I think it's not easy to leave a place. So there was also a sexual harassment scandal in there. So it was like locusts, everything but locusts in terms of plagues.
They're on their way. Don't worry.
Yeah, and I think it's sad because I think it's still a good magazine. I think it's still great staff trying to do good work. But it's arduous, to say the least.
Now, the sexual harassment thing involved the guy who was at that. He was chief content officer or something of was it Newsweek or the whole Newsweek media group or what?
I believe of the whole group. I may be
which includes the International Business Times.
Yeah, that is the company that bought Newsweek in 2013.
And it has a connection to a Korean church.
It does indeed. So that's that always kind of raises eyebrows. I mean, people will think of the Unification Church and the Washington Times.
Yeah, but it's not that. It's a more conventionally Christian church than
well, that. Well, that's precisely, exactly. And I joke in this piece I wrote for Politico that, the place was not cult-like at all. There were no church services and no apparent ideology. I in a joke that, I'm sure you got, I said, compared to some of the other owners I've worked for, the Martin Parrots of the New Republic or Charlie Peters of the Washington Monthly or other strong-willed editor owners, this was anything but Jonestown,
Right.
So anyway, this firing kind of made it untenable, and it seems that the Manhattan DA is exploring ties between the owners and the church, but we don't really know at the moment.
So one thing So I gather what got the Manhattan DA involved is this advertising scandal. And I think that involved ads not on Newsweek per se, but in the International Business Times. Is that correct?
Well, it's not entirely clear. I think what got them interested seems to be the chain of custody of some servers, which they hauled out of the Newsweek offices a couple of weeks ago. They may have, played some games in terms of financing those servers. I'm just not sure. It's like all investigations. It's a closed grand jury, but they may also be investigating still another problem at the place, which is the accusation that they had committed a kind of ad fraud.
Right. Now,
a charge I should say the company, strenuously denies and says was hyped by BuzzFeed, which wrote the story.
Right. And this is, I'll talk a little more about what I understand about the ad scandal,
Sure.
But I think in principle, at least, I mean, even if the scandal is made up, there is a connection between the pressure to serve a lot of ads and the facility with which dubious news stories can appear on your website, right? Because they're both related to the hunger for traffic, or to generate traffic at very low cost, maybe we should say. Is that right? And I know in your political piece, you start off by saying your frustration was mounting as you saw just crazy fake news appearing sometimes in the International Business Times, occasionally I think in Newsweek itself. In one case, it was an actual Onion story that they hadn't realized was a joke, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think, first of all, I regret in the piece not sort of, emphasizing that I really think the place continues to do good work and it's a good staff and it's a good magazine.
You kind of nodded at least a little in that direction.
I didn't do enough of that, so I regret that. But, there have been some noticeable errors. Now, when you say fake news, people might think like deliberate
Yeah, no, I didn't mean, I just mean things that aren't true, like an Onion piece.
Yeah, I mean, that was unfortunate. I do think, it's possible traffic pressures were the cause of some prominent errors in the last few months. And those are tough in any environment for news organizations to have to defend. But I think especially now, and the media is under fire from the White House and other places, it's hard to get things wrong. So the places had to deal with that as well. I do think, there is enormous pressure in the media to create traffic because that's one revenue stream. The more people who look at your story, the more you can make from advertisements. The same principle that applies to television, for instance.
Right. But the ad rates are so low that the pressure is to generate the traffic really cheaply. I mean, as I said, we'll later get to how cushy life used to be for the Newsweekly staffer, But these days, I mean, one thing, I read the BuzzFeed, part of the BuzzFeed piece that I know, the owners of Newsweek have denied, but, about the alleged ad scandal. So first of all, the alleged scandal is that International Business Tribune, I guess it had an ad contract. It was doing ads for this government agency, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or something.
Right. That's the Elizabeth Warren thing. Yeah.
Recently kind of created agency. They wanted to place a bunch of ads, had a big ad budget, bought some of them from these IBT people. They needed to serve a certain number of ads to either qualify for the contract or discharge the terms for it or whatever. But the allegation is that some of them were these shady kinds of things where you basically pay to have ads placed in a pop-up window on like some video pirating site or something. Sometimes the ad isn't even visible to the person on the site, but technically it's been served and so on. So anyway, there was that set of allegations. But one thing that I think I saw in the BuzzFeed piece, and this is related, I think, to the pressure to generate a lot of page views at low cost, is that the address for IBT, where the supposed editorial offices were in Australia, where you would think there would be these journalists there for the Australian content, I guess, on IBT. The people there were not connected to IBT, and in fact, the editorial content seemed to be coming from people in the Philippines. So the thing, and again, this isn't Newsweek we're talking about. This is IBT owned by the same people. But the scenario I had in mind was so they have these very low-paid people in the Philippines who speak English, but they're not like what you think of when you think of an Australian journalist. And
Right.
they're generating as much clickbait as possible, as fast as possible. And I would think that's one way you wind up with an Onion piece being, somebody mistaking it for real news.
Yeah, well, I think that's possible. And again, they're pushing back, saying that no, IBT didn't do these things they're accused of in that BuzzFeed piece. But be that as it may, the world we're in at all publications has a lot of pressure to produce stories that make a big bang and that have a lot of traffic. And as you say, the ad rates are pretty low, so you need a really big bang to get much money, and much less, of course, than you would have in the olden times with a nice big print ad.
Yeah. And I actually think this is just an asterisk, but I think in a time of political polarization, this pressure, look, there's always been pressure to generate viewers and readers. That's always been the name of the game.
Sure.
But the more intense the pressure, the more intense the effect I'm talking about, which is that I think it just kind of deepens the tribalism on both sides, because the way you get people to click is on the one side, Trump is evil, on the other side, Obama is evil. So I personally think that's a little bit of a byproduct of the click race.
Well, I think there is definitely a relation between the two. And of course, the fact that, in the olden days, you knew how many Time magazines sold, but you didn't know which stories were being read.
Right.
Right. Now you know how each story is doing, and you realize that, some are doing great, some are loss leaders. Yeah. You probably could have guessed in the old days what was driving a purchase, but you were really just guessing.
Now, this is an important point.
Now down to the minute, how many people are looking, what device they're looking on, how long they're staying on the story, where they came from. Did they get there from Facebook or Twitter or an ad? So there is all this data out there, and this is, this is true for everybody, of course, now. And then I think that puts, pressure kind of on all stories. Again, I think Newsweek got its traffic up mostly through actually a lot of really good work.
Yeah.
But there, obviously a couple of things were not, not well done. But.
Yeah, it's funny. Before we came on air, you said you had just seen Mike Kinsley, who was the editor of the New Republic. I don't know if he was editor when you were there with me. He had been, but anyway, we both know Mike, and you saw him recently. He won, I think the greatest editor of his generation for my money, which is also my generation. When he started Slate, he said to me, we now have stats on how individual articles are doing. People may now not realize how revolutionary that was. He said, we now have stats on how many people read each individual article. And he said, I don't think I'm going to give those numbers to writers because I think it'll be a corrupting influence. Now, ultimately, Slate, like everyone, at some point down the road did make those accessible, I'm sure, to writers.
Sure.
But he understood the peril and of people, of writers thinking, well, what gets the most clicks? And of course, even if editors have that information, it can be corrupting in the same way.
Yeah, and there's nothing, inherently wrong about his story doing well. I mean, I think the New York Times best read stories in recent months have been this revealing the Harvey Weinstein scandal. Great reporting, right. Fascinating reading, interesting writing, and so it did very well. It's not like it's synonymous with poor quality journalism. Right. And Newsweek got its numbers up mostly through that, and there were some mistakes along the way. That happens. I think, to be in a newsroom today, almost every newsroom I've worked in the last 10 years has had big video display models with a program called Chartbeat that tells you what among the stories that publication is putting out that day, how it's doing, where it's rising and falling in the scheme of things, who's reading it, where they're from, are they abroad, are they here, are they on a phone, are they on a tablet? It's just an incredible amount of knowledge. And, I think when you and I were magazine writers, I think we looked at, with some pity at those in television who worried about Nielsen ratings, down to 15-minute increments or, those kind of pressures. that it exists now. I think that's why it's, I think the best places have probably done a good job diversifying all the ways they make money. Either they were owned by a gazillionaire like Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post, or they've got content that people will pay for. They've put up a paywall, or they do events or other things. They can keep the money coming in. They're not just dependent on these ads.
And tell me if your recollection coincides with mine in terms of the kind of feedback you did get as a writer that could shape what you did. As I recall, I mean, we were both at the New Republic. Although I was never a staffer at a news magazine, I was a contributor at a time on kind of on contract for a while. But certainly, you didn't have individual numbers about individual articles. It seems to me the main form of feedback you got about individual articles was what your colleagues thought about them, or what kind of feedback an editor got at a cocktail party or something, or maybe what the owner, Marty Parrott's got but the point is, it was relatively speaking, quote, elite feedback, right? It was your colleagues. It was.
Yeah.
Is that your recollection that was a...
Well, a little more. I mean, you would hear from readers. And of course,
get the occasional letter from an editor.
Once things in the 90s, were online, you would see reader comments and things. But in general, in the
pre-internet.
Yeah, in the pre-internet era, it was pretty much, the delayed reaction of snail mail letters to the editors.
Right.
Or if the story got some pickup in other publications, if you broke some big news and... then it would get a lot of attention.
Yeah.
The fellow I covered the White House with revealed that George H.W. Bush didn't like broccoli, so we it became a widely, it made it to Johnny Carson. But in general, you're right. It was an elite feedback more than a popular feedback.
I remember once I did a cover story for Time, and it was mentioned favorably by David Broder in the Washington Post.
Right.
That was like a big deal. And now it would be like either you've got the numbers or you don't. Like it's good that you're being mentioned. That would be a good thing, not a bad thing. Right. But then I remember how much emphasis was put, how happy that made people at Time magazine that you got that. Or or like you said with broccoli, if you actually started a story rolling and it showed up on TV.
Right. No, that was a big thing. I got a big bonus one year at Time because I found out that George W. Bush was keeping Saddam's gun in his study, the gun that Saddam was found with when they found him, buried in a hole. And
oh, really?
So, that went kind of the equivalent of viral at the time. And, it's, obviously we're in a more populist democratic moment where, you're more responsive to the crowd and you know what the crowd's thinking, or mob, if you want to look at it that way. There's some benefits to that. I have interactions with the readers via Twitter or email or other things that I think are, by and large healthy. There's also the, tons of crazy invective that comes with, even the most benign articles can lead to, dozens of anti-Semitic comments or other things. So it's, it's very much a different world.
So the situation at Newsweek, I mean, for you, the big thing was when they started, when they fired the editors, because the editors had authorized Newsweek reporters to look into the investigation of Newsweek.
Yeah, at that point, I thought I'd go. I just thought, it was sort of untenable at that point.
Is it still? I mean, the new editor is like a,
Well, the new editor is she is. She's someone I worked with at Newsweek in the 90s. This is actually my second tour of duty at Newsweek. She's a terrific journalist, and, I hope she can find a way to press forward both on that story and other things. So, I'm wishing former colleagues well. But, for me, it was time to go, and I guess about a dozen other people have chosen the same path. But you were saying earlier about the, the once formidable legacy of the Newsweeklies.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that. Now, and let's go back to the very beginning, because you allude to this in your Politico piece, what was the idea behind the Newsweekly when Henry Luce and what was the guy's name? Was it Britton?
Yeah, Britton Haddon.
Yeah, the two Yale graduates, very young, started Time magazine. So what was the idea?
The idea then as now was that the busy man was inundated by and it was man.
That was his quote. I mean, he said in the famous quote,
busy man is just inundated by information. Most cities had 10 newspapers. There was a lot to read in terms of print. And he was right. A lot of it was not, terribly well written or interesting. And so his idea was to come up with a weekly magazine that was, terribly well written and lively, was sort of cut through things. And, he got some investors and put it together. And it quickly took off, became an American icon. He, interesting story. It's probably Time may be best known for its Person of the Year cover. It's formerly known as Man of the Year. It turned out, though, in 1927, when Charles Lindbergh was celebrated globally for the first transatlantic flight, Time really barely covered it that week. And so at the end of the year, to put the still very popular Lindbergh on the cover, they came up with this conceit, Man of the Year.
Is that right? That's how it started?
And it continues, more
just because they missed the story the first time around.
Yeah, they missed it. And so it was like it was a gimme. I mean, it's almost as much of an accident as the iconic cover of another Time Inc. publication, Sports Illustrated, which threw bikini-clad models on the cover one February in the season between the Super Bowl.
And who'd have guessed that it sold well?
Yeah. So apparently a magazine named it Man putting attractive women on the cover did well. And, So, look, this idea of the Newsweekly was, did incredibly well, so much so that, Newsweek also grew at the same time. There was enough market, as they say, for it to exist. And then for what had been a more conservative version of same, the U.S. News and World Report. And all three existed and grew and made a whole bunch of money. Just tons of money,
Yeah. I remember you talk a little about this. I had a deal with Time magazine, where, and this is, you'd have to adjust for inflation. So, this was mid 90s. So it'd actually be more than this, but I was getting paid $5 a word. And you would write long cover stories in those days sometimes. You'd do 4,000 or 5,000 word cover stories, 6,000. So you could make, it was a good deal because I had been in a competitive bidding situation when I did that deal. But still, you can do like $25,000, $30,000 for an article. And now that seems like, even if you don't adjust for inflation, that seems like an outrageous amount of money to make for an article.
No, it's absolutely true. I don't think I'm giving a lot away to say my salary is lower now than it was in the 90s, not adjusted for inflation.
And you say...
now my salary's nothing because I quit. But they were... look, they had kind of a built-in audience. People renewed their subscriptions at pretty high rates. There was some churn, but they were able to keep millions of subscriptions going. They had brisk newsstand sales. So that helped a lot. And it was a prestigious place for advertisers to be. And the idea was that, it was around all week. It wasn't a 30-minute TV show or a daily newspaper. So that ad for General Motors or another American corporation would linger a while. And so, they did very well. And, but, again, the same problems that befell print befell them. And then the same problems that befell all general interest news, whether it was the network evening news or, national newspapers. I think it was got tougher as advertisers tended to want more specific markets. If you just wanted young men to sell a Pontiac to, no reason to buy an ad in Time. Just go right to Rolling Stone or Vice or Hot Rod or something.
Yeah.
So they were victims of both the end of the mass consumption. Not the end, but the troubling headwinds for mass consumption. Something first seen perhaps with the end of Life magazine in the early 70s.
Right.
that could no longer, stand up against TV and be a national, beautiful magazine of photographs. So, the mag suffered. I think in their, they created a culture, I think, of some interesting writings, some things that were, just more idiosyncratic or odd and probably, best forgotten. Time magazine had a tendency to start sentences with verbs. Says he.
Oh, yeah, that was a thing.
Backwards reeled the mind.
Yeah.
There were some funny stylistic adaptations, but there was also great reporting, and of course that continued into the current Newsweek. So, there's no sense in raging one's fist at the sky and lamenting the rain. I mean, these circumstances changed, and all these places have to, find a way to adapt.
But I do remember when I was, 12, 13, the only magazines I remember coming into the house were Reader's Digest and Newsweek, and maybe Life for a while or something. But but it just makes your point that it would be lying on the coffee table all week. You might pick it up, even me as a 12-year-old kid. You might pick it up several times. There wasn't much else to do. There were only 3 TV networks. I mean,
yeah.
It was,
and most people lived in towns that didn't have good papers. I mean, if you grew up in the New York or Philly area or LA, you had a great, strong local urban daily. But if you were in most of the country, your paper was probably not very good.
Right. The Newsweekly, that's an interesting question. To what extent was it a middle American phenomenon? Now I think of, among the Newsweeklies, I think of U.S. News and World Report as being more middle American, maybe in its sensibility, a little less cosmopolitan, but...
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, Time had a kind of erudition about it.
Right.
Gary, someone like yourself was an essayist and a writer, and Gary Wills, and, kind of...
And that art critic, who was the famous art critic?
Robert Hughes.
Yeah. That was great writing. Robert Hughes was a great writer.
They were serious critics, and the cultural coverage and that stuff was kind of highbrow. It was kind of aspirational middle class.
Exactly.
U.S. News prided itself on being, just the facts. Long before We Report, You Decide, U.S. News, which had a conservative bent until the 1980s, was very much like that.
Yeah.
With a lot of covers about the missile gap with Russia. Newsweek was always sort of the plucky underdog to Time. It had another story from News Magazine Lore. When Kennedy was assassinated, Time had a longstanding policy not to put dead people on the cover. And so they put, Lyndon Johnson on the cover after Kennedy was killed. Newsweek put JFK on the cover, and it sold much better. And it's, a big moment. And then Newsweek would continue to probably do better than Time in terms of its Vietnam coverage. So the 60s really...
Because it became skeptical of the war sooner than Time?
I think its reporting was a little bit better, as I recall. But that Kennedy thing was one of those, kind of iconic moments where, it had been unheard of for Newsweek to outsell Time at the newsstand.
Yeah. And a part of the Time story, of course, is that Henry Luce, who founded it and guided it for decades thereafter, he had his ideology, and
very much so.
And he exerted influence in this very subtle way. They didn't overtly editorialize.
No, right.
It was in terms of the way they presented the news had a certain shape to it. The people they chose to put on the cover had a certain. Like Reinhold Niebuhr, the famous theologian, was on the cover, I think, twice. And had he not become a bit of a cold warrior at some point in his career, I kind of doubt he would have. Oh,
absolutely. And I think, I think mostly to good effect in the 40s when the Luce family did a lot behind the scenes and in the magazine to promote Wendell Willkie, an interventionist, to be the Republican nominee in 1940. He was for Lend-Lease and other things Roosevelt was trying to do to help Britain hang on. I think if Willkie had not gotten the nomination, there's a case to be made that England might have fallen. part of the reason Wilkie got the nomination in a very heated convention in Philadelphia is because of the Luce family.
Yeah, no, and this is an important point. It's hard for people to appreciate today how a single magazine could have had that much influence, but it had a huge amount of influence.
And to also think of itself in some ways now that we find we might bristle at as a custodian of institutions, actually feeling like it had a stake in who, the Republican nominee would be and whatnot. So, it's a fascinating history. There have been a lot of colorful people who've worked at these places. I'm glad I was there in robust times as well as reinvention times.
Now, I think near the end of your piece, you make the argument that there continues to be the demand for something that, to some extent, fulfills the original mission of Time, which is concise, clear summary of the news.
Well, right. I think there's still a search for, I think people are still even inundated by information, much more so now because of ubiquitous smartphones and whatnot. So I think things that kind of cut through the clutter are still something that readers are looking for and that publishers are looking for. So Axios, the web publication, is kind of taken off, started by former Politico folks, and its tagline is smart brevity. So it gives you bullet points for stories, and then you can click on a place if you want to read more. But really, they're just giving you the hot news that they've discovered. And Bloomberg has started a similar kind of thing on Twitter. So I think there's a search for the things that news magazines did well. One was brevity. One was kind of spicier writing that was clear and narrative, I think people have a desire for that too. And so, and great photographs and things. So I think some of the things Newsweekly's provided are still in demand, whether, they can continue to push against these, economic troubles and make it work. We'll see. Now, Time Inc. was recently bought by Meredith Publishing. Meredith is the Des Moines-based publisher of old, not, kind of newsier titles, but things like Family Circle, Successful Farmer, Better Homes and Gardens, magazines that have been around the better part of a century that have continued to make a good amount of money. And it was a real cultural shift, when Meredith bought Time Inc.
Are the Time journalists still in New York? They're not in the Time Light building, I guess. But
no, they're down in. They had moved down to the Freedom Tower a couple of years back, and they're still there. But Time Inc. no longer exists. The parent publication of Time Magazine, Fortune, Life.
Time Warner. One of the less charitable things done by that corporation was to spin off Time Inc. and load it up with debt, which I just thought was kind of unconscionable. I mean, it's okay if you want to, unload this kind of legacy, the thing that started you, without which you would not exist. It's fine if you've decided it's a burden and you want to set it free. But I mean, saddling it with debt like that, I'm sorry.
Well, that was unfortunate. I think a lot of these companies have gotten so big that we'll see a trend towards their breakup at some point. Time Inc. stood alone for a long time, then it merged with Warner Brothers, Warner Communications. Eventually, it was bought by AOL. Didn't work. It was one of the kind of great crash stories of the early 2000s. Now Time Inc.'s on its own, and for a few months and for a couple of years, and now it is no more. I think some of these huge companies, Verizon now owns the Huffington Post and Yahoo. These are enormous telecom media companies that produce content, and they own the pipes, so to speak. I'll be curious to see how that plays out. And of course, Time Warner is merging with AT&T to become just
hoping to merge with AT&T. Trump had said skeptical things about that, but of course that was before AT&T said, "Thank you for your tax cut, Donald Trump. We are going to give bonus," whatever they said. And I just want to. This is a tangent. AT&T started that whole thing. They were the first big company to say, because of this tax reform, we are able to do huge, great publicity for Trump. And I got to think, if they were not angling for, relief from antitrust oversight as they do this merger, they might not have done that. I mean, I don't want to sound cynical.
I don't think you're overly cynical. Look, they have armies of lobbyists, trying to make sure this merger does go through. I think the thinking generally is that it will, despite Trump and the Justice Department having raised some questions. Some of the initial regulatory things have already been cleared. The FTC and the FCC didn't raise hackles, so I think it will happen. And, those bonuses probably didn't hurt.
Let me, I want to plug something I'm doing just because it has oddly turned out to be what the original Time magazine was doing. So I started this thing called the Mindful Resistance newsletter, and the premise of Mindful Resistance was just that, like, okay, I'm anti-Trump, but I think some of the opposition to Trump is like overwrought, too emotionally reactive. Mm-hmm. And also I'd come out with a Buddhism book I'm a champion of mindfulness meditation, but the newsletter is not really about meditation. It's just about being like careful, deliberate, attentive, aware as we try to proceed to, try to put an end to the Trump era ASAP. And the underlying things he represents, in my view, like whatever, bigotry, whatever. What we found so we start the newsletter off with something called the Week in Trump, and originally it was just something to try, but it's become a big part of the thing where you just have a short, like a paragraph on a bunch of things in some way related to Trump, and part of the idea is if you did take a few days off of social media, which might be good for your mental health, might make you more mindful, you would have this to read. But the other thing is to just be very non-hysterical about it, even though we are not approving of many things he does. So I don't know where this is going to go. We've been doing it for 6 months. We got 6,000 subscribers. And it grows every week. It's enough to keep going, and people can subscribe at mindfulresistance.net. But, go ahead.
I think that's very smart. And one thing I never feel badly I never really executed on at Newsweek was, I was going to start out what's worth worrying about and what's not related to Trump, almost as a matrix,
That's interesting. Maybe graphically. We should actually label things. That's a good label. Yeah,
let me know if you need an intern. I have some free time. But I do think people feel so inundated, generally by news, but especially by kind of hysteria in the Trump era.
Yeah.
Hysteria is probably the wrong word, but I think, I feel like very few liberal magazines sort of sort out what would be, what's he doing that any Republican president would do? Even a sort of an honorable figure like Mitt Romney or John McCain, what would they be doing that's similar? And then what's he doing that's uniquely Trumpian and perhaps more threatening to the country's fabric? Even that simple distinction, I feel, rarely gets.
No, it's hard. I mean, it's like, in fact, in the last newsletter, I analyzed the whole military parade thing. And I said, I was surprised to find John Kennedy had one for his inaugural. It hasn't only been a wartime thing. So I don't know. Is this, but anyway, that kind of,
well, I think that filtering, that sorting through in a reliable and trusted way is awfully important. I think it's very hard when people are just getting barraged.
So what, you've now that you've put in your application for an internship, and of course ours are unpaid, and I'm sure you're fine with that. But seriously, you're just kind of looking around now?
Yeah, I mean, talking to people. I have some writing assignments for places, so I've got plenty to do, and so I'll be fine. I'm not worried.
That's good. You're in DC, right?
Yeah, I live here in Washington, where I've been a long time, and yeah. So no, I'm fine going forward. I mean, I think journalism has a bright future. I hope the newsweeklies do too, and we'll see.
One question: when the Week started, the publication known as The Week. And I think it started almost pre-internet, didn't it? I mean, originally it was a physical week. It was a physical thing.
Right.
That was kind of a resurrection of the original idea, wasn't it? I mean, I was surprised. Actually, I don't think it was. Maybe it wasn't pre-internet, because I think I remember being surprised they'd try it.
Well, I think it was an early and I think impressive form of aggregation. You know, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of, Huffington Post was in a way like The Week, only put through an amplifier, but in the sense that they aggregate a lot of news stories that were already out there and kind of put them under their own headline and try to make money that way. And, The Week did a kind of smart job of that.
Yeah.
They were borrowing from other sources.
Yeah, no, aggregation is...
And that's really what the Drudge Report was and is, too.
Well, not only that, but do you know how Breitbart got its start?
I don't.
Okay, so this is an interesting aggregation story. So, yeah, of course, the Drudge Report, I mean, it's an aggregator, it's an aggregation of links. It doesn't actually feature the content on its site, which is another form of aggregation, but it links to it. But Andrew Breitbart knew Drudge, and he saw how much traffic Drudge was driving. Mm-hmm. This is the story as told to me by Mickey Kaus. He saw how much traffic Drudge was driving to... often to Associated Press stories. And Drudge might link to the Cleveland Plain Dealers version or the LA Times version or whatever, but there were a lot of AP stories. And so Breitbart said, how about if I start a site? I will just subscribe to AP, and every time you link to an AP story, you link to my site's version of it. And that was the beginning of Breitbart. It was an ingenious business model.
Yeah, and he was a HuffPost alumni, so it was all in that
Breitbart,
same...
Breitbart
yeah,
was?
Andrew Breitbart had worked with Arianna Huffington. So,
and now Trump is president. The rest is history.
And now Trump is president. So
we've come full circle. Anything else you want to say about the news? I mean, you have said, do you want to emphasize that Newsweek is still full of great journalists and it's not like it became a cesspool of fake news or anything like that.
No.
It sounds like the fake news problem was more in the IBT, as a kind of a sister publication or something.
A little bit of that, but no, I just I think it's I think it's just incumbent upon journalists to find a way forward, to find a way to make these things profitable, or if not profitable, then to find a ProPublica or some nonprofit model and just, keep on doing what they're doing. Okay,
we'll link to your Politico piece about this, and then we'll also include your Twitter handle. What is your Twitter handle? It's
Mattiz-Coop, Mattizzcoop.
Which was at one time at least your email address. I won't reveal the domain name.
Yeah.
Is that still your email address?
Yeah. Yeah,
but we won't reveal the domain name.
If you don't want to, it's fine. I mean, it's okay. I mean,
but on Twitter, it's Mattiz-Coop.
Yeah,
it's a place to go. All right,
absolutely, sir.
Well, thank you, Matt. Great to catch up, and I'm impressed that you resigned on principle. Not many people do that.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay.